If you're watching this video, then chances are high that you converted over from a YouTube channel. If that is the case, then you're here because you want to learn. You want to know how to improve your miniatures, how to make them look better. You want to learn new techniques and how to apply them, but also why we apply a technique in a certain case. And this is all my channel is about. The videos are structured the way they are because I want you to understand how I painted the miniature, but I also want you to understand the whys behind my choices. So all my videos are structured with this in mind. I want you to realize that there is multiple ways of painting miniatures, and I want you to find your way of painting. I'm not here to sell you one particular technique as the ultimate technique. I'm always going to try to show you as many techniques, as many approaches as possible, so you can decide what approach you like, what techniques you like, what way of painting is going to fit you. Of course, not every miniature always offers options to show you new techniques and new approaches, but I will always explain why I'm doing something and all my thought processes so that you can get a maximum out of your pledge. This video series is going to be 4 videos. I decided to edit them together thematically, so we are going to look at the metallics and how I did them, and then the weapon casings. We're going to look at the OSL elements and what is important with OSL, and I'm going to show you how I did all the glowing elements like the weapons and the eyes. Don't forget to join the Discord server if you have any questions. That is the fastest way to reach me. Hopefully you're going to learn a lot. Thanks a lot for your support and enjoy the video. On the Immortals, I started to spray dark aluminum with an airbrush. You see that the weapon casing also gets hit by a bit of a mist of the metals, and the rest stays black. I'm making sure that most of the body is covered. I'm kind of leaving the same, black to shine through a bit on the lower parts. It's just a bit of a way to create focus on the upper parts, on the more interesting parts, on the parts that we want the viewer to focus on. Again, the weapon casing, I feel like that's the only thing that is a benefit of the airbrush. You can see the mist hit the weapon casing, and there's some parts that remain darker, and that is going to help us with creating something really unique in the later parts of the weapon. Again, you can use the layer metallics with brush or by brush, and they're going to look good. It's just that you cannot really get that effect that is going to give some extra texture on the weapon casings if you use a brush, but you can do anything else in this tutorial if you don't have an airbrush. I added a tiny bit of white aluminum to the mix to create something of a highlight, and I sprayed a second coat over the upper parts of the miniature. To illustrate the difference, I sprayed the death mark exclusively in white aluminum, and you can see that it's a lot brighter. I also kept the slightly darker areas on the legs. Then we're going in with the Necron flesh tone, and I'm creating the initial gradients, and what I do is I push the ink into the recesses. I make sure that they stay there. You can control the ink a lot, as you can see here, capillary forces, push it into the middle of that ridge on the back of the Necron and into all the recesses, and it covers at the same time all surfaces slightly, so it tints all the surfaces but it shades them too, and we can push these diluted pigments into the areas that we want shaded. So this is the result after the first round of Necron flesh. You can see that, most of the deeper parts are shaded. Sometimes we don't really catch everything on the first go, then you can definitely add a second one, more quicker layer to shade everything. And then I'm going a bit slower and make sure that the pigments stay in the areas that I want shaded. And again, you can force these pigments into areas that you want darker. Anything that curves down, obviously we want a bit shaded. And I'm going slower, and I'm taking more care, and I'm just putting that tiny extra bit of the ink on the areas that I want darker, and I do that a couple of times. And that creates a gradient, as you can also see on the hand, for example. Just carefully dabbing on tiny spots, and those spots will be denser, and they're going to shade these elements more intensively. This is one step up from using inks more promiscuously. We're really taking the properties of the inks, and we're taking them and using them to our advantage, and making the ink stay in areas that we want shaded. And because of the properties, the transitions are going to be smooth, and we're going to get gradients. Then for this death mark, I was using the white aluminium in a very diluted way, and I started on the edges, and you can see that it creates a reflective area. Almost looks like white on the video, and this is a good way to create contrast. It's almost like highlighting non-metallic metal with white. And we can also apply this selectively, so on any culmination points we can add a wider stroke of that, like you can see on the face mask. In the middle of that curve, I'm leaving a bit of an extra wider dot, and it creates good contrast, good readability that way. I'm diluting the color a lot more, and then I'm also touching the areas of the planes, so I'm painting in highlights. As you can see, it's very diluted, not a lot of pigment on the brush. It's almost like we're glazing with metallics. Works pretty good with these Vallejo metallics because they're so thin. Then I'm continuing to do the edges. You can just do edges, and it's going to look good, especially on these smaller elements like here on the back. But you can also, like I did before, highlight these areas up if you wanted them brighter. But the minimum that we have to put in here is the edge highlights. And then I'm going back to Reclon Flesh, and I'm shading some areas a bit more. This is to create more contrast. We have the highlights, but the metallics want to be darker, and you can use any color you want here and just dilute it. I just like the inks because they keep that bit of transparency, and it takes a few extra layers, but that also means our transitions are going to be smoother because of the transparency. And you can see I'm just selectively putting dabs of the ink onto areas that I want shaded. Then I'm using Rhinoxide and Mornfang Brown, and I just create a mix that I think is dark enough. You can of course vary that. Here I'm trying to find a good consistency that will allow me to dab on small dots. So I'm trying it out on my thumbnail, and you can see that I'm finding the right way to push down to leave a nice mark, a nice pattern. And then you can see I'm just leaving tiny spots, and these have really rugged edges, which you could try to use a brush, and it's going to leave different patterns, different marks. The chipping method here with the sponge leaves these jagged edges and random patterns. Sometimes it's more a line than a dot, and that looks really, really credible in my opinion. So sometimes I dab on a bit harder, and then it's leaving a wider mark, and sometimes I just barely touch it to leave like 2 or 3 dots. And again, you can see that the pattern looks really, really interesting. These sharper edges is what I like here. Again, you could use a brush and paint rounder parts. If you wanted some different stain marks, you can combine the two approaches. Anything is possible here. And of course I'm doing that on both of the figures that I'm painting in this tutorial, so that you can see all the variations that I do. On the second figure I'm actually more brave because I have the technique down a bit more controlled already after the first one, and you can see that I'm dabbing on larger stains and alternate between stain sizes, and add some variety. You can go as hard as you want or as little as you want. I just really want to stain these boys up because they have been sleeping for 60 million years. And the more detail, especially on these large shoulder pads, the more detail we put in there, the better it's going to look, because if this is a plain large surface, then it's going to look boring. So that is the main reason behind the chipping, to break up monotony and add more detail and credibility to the figure. Then I'm using a bit of Agrax Earth Shade mixed into the Raphael flesh, so that I have a darker base. With everything shading related, we want to start from a darker base, and then if we want it brighter, we can always add brighter color. In this case, I'm moving into more of a pure Raphael flesh shade to put on there. And again, it's a more controlled way of applying this. The first layer goes on less controlled. I try to cover everything with at least one layer. I make sure that none of the highlight parts are too obscured by it, so I push the ink into the dark areas, so it's an initial shade that I put down. But already here, this improves everything so much. And just have a bit of brush control in there, control where the ink flows already here. As you can see on the back, I pull it downwards. With the spine, we can be a bit more unselective, just push it in there and it's going to find its way, because that part is so structured. But the parts that are larger, they need a bit more guidance, so that the ink stays where we want the shades to be. Obviously all these parts facing up, we want those to be bright and not as much covered by the ink. Then after that is done, I'm moving into more controlled applications of the ink, and I think already here I'm starting to mix in color, so that in this case I wanted a bit more of a orange brown, so I mixed in Mornfang brown, and then later we're going to add a bit more Scrag brown, because it looks a bit more like rust. And you can see I'm pushing the pigments to the areas that I want shaded, and whenever a transition is too rough, we can take a damp brush and just wipe away some pigments in the transitional areas. And you can see I'm really going controlled, and I'm taking my time, and I'm adding pigments to the darker areas. For example, on the rib cage, in between those ribs, I want that dark. Then you can see I'm dabbing on the brush, and some of the pigment comes off, like on the front of the head and the temples, and I just make sure that it stays where I want the shade to be. And again, the properties of the ink, even if we mix in color, allows us to do this, and it's staying in parts that that we want the pigments to stay in. Like I said, you can use any color, any wash, any ink. If you want to introduce different colors, the principle is the same. Just cover everything once so that it gets stained, so that the whole area gets stained, and then add more controlled washes if you want to shade these areas. Here I'm using Druki Violet. You can use any ink that you can get. Personally, I'm using the Liquitex inks, but Dala Rowney inks also work pretty well. And then you can see on smaller elements I'm dabbing on even more controlled, anything, you know, particularly those neck protectors on those small parts. It works really well to just place a bit of pigment, and capillary effects are going to hold it in place. Anything that goes up, I'm shading that down so that the part that is a bit more parallel to the sky gets more of a highlight. And one thing to keep in mind, we need to add a few layers of ink. It's not going to be a one-off process. You know, you can go a bit faster. Obviously, you're going to trade in a bit of cleanliness, but you can also go very controlled and achieve really awesome results, and really controlled and smooth results. So what I'm doing here is, again, I'm going back to the Scrag Brown Rickland Flesh mix to add a bit more rusty feeling, to draw the two figures together. And I'm also adding it over areas that are already shaded with a different color. You can do that a couple of times. We're going to see on the casings that I used a lot of colors, especially on that blue casing, to add color shades and variation, and it looks really good. And you can see that on the second Immortal with the Tesla carbine. I do the same thing to add a bit more of a rusty feeling, and the two figures get tied together by using, you know, at least one color that is the same, in this case a bit of a rusty color. You can see the Scrag Brown added makes for a brighter ink, and as I added to the spine, it feels like the ink is finding the correct recesses to rest in, and the end result is going to look like a really rusty, aged metal. Again, it's going to take a few layers. If you want more opaque results, you need to add more acrylic color into those inks right away. I'm trying not to obscure too many of the highlights right away, so I'm shading towards the lower parts. And again, this is adding a rust effect, but it is also adding a shade effect on the areas that are further down, and not touching the upper areas and leaving them metallics is keeping our highlights and shadow structure. And you can see how the color variations come to life, and I really like those results. And just playing with the metallics still shining through, but being slightly tinted, and just putting on more and more detail. And another thing that I do is I'm treating panels that are next to each other a bit different. So on that right side, I'm adding a bit more rust than on the left side. And then adding a bit more scrag brown, you can see that it looks a bit more orange here. I'm adding a more intense rust effect to those very deep recesses. I just like how over an initial shade that orange rust effect looks. And then I'm also dabbing on some dots onto areas, and you can see how it dries almost immediately and leaves some residue and some, yeah, really awesome rust effects. Then we're moving into highlighting the metallics. Initially I showed you how I did it. Now we're going to move into more detail. You can see I'm starting with the edges. It's always a good thing because just adding the slightest amount of pigment on these edges, yeah, it just looks great. Like I said, it's because it reflects so much light. You can see that it creates contrast immediately, and you can just work on these edges, or you can, like I do here, add, you know, pixels of the metallic pigment, and again it's going to reflect light, and we can do gradients that way. You see that I just hit the lower parts of that arm and leave the upper parts darker and shaded, and it's almost like if we were painting non-metallic metal, you would do the same thing with the white pigments to pick out some edges and to create some highlights. So this whole way of painting metallics is basically trying to do what we are doing with the non-metallic metal, just placing highlights and dull areas next to each other. And we are placing deliberate highlights, and we're not just hoping that the pigment below the metallic pigments of the base color is going to create our reflections. We are also deliberately putting reflections in some areas that we want more intense, that we want to reflect more light, and we are leaving some areas duller and yeah, more shaded. So I'm working on these edges. Again, it's to increase readability and to distinguish parts from each other. And I'm going slow and deliberate, and yeah, all these edge highlights are not really just strokes. They have some variability to it, some variety to it. We have irregularities in the armor, and those edges would be banged up too, so some parts are going to catch more light and some are going to catch less. On the top part, I'm also adding highlights again, not just on the edges, and you can see that due to the diluted nature, it just leaves some of the pigment, and it creates these gradients that just look great because we have duller areas, and this creates more reflective parts, like I said. It just looks really, really awesome. So on the spine area, we can just add some edge highlights and just touch some areas, and it's increasing the value. You can see that it immediately gets really bright, and those edges and parts that stick out get defined, and it just creates instant information. And readability, and yeah, it's a pretty easy way to get results quickly. Speaking about additional information, we can always add scratches and dots on surfaces that are a tiny bit too boring maybe. So the same thing that we did with the stains on the shoulder parts, we can add scratches and highlights on the areas, like here on the back of the hand, for example, and it just looks credible and realistic instantly with very little effort. Again, with non-metallic metal, we would do that with white paint, probably to simulate scratches and just slight nicks that would reflect more light. And coming back to how non-metallic metal works, creating a highlight pattern on the forearm here, where we would place a highlight with white if it were non-metallic metal. And then just picking out some of the parts that are higher up, in this case the Necron tier symbol. I'm just touching that slightly, and then using the brighter metallics, the white aluminium, I'm just picking that out even more, and it's a really striking effect. So using the pure white aluminium, I'm just going over the edges and everything that I highlighted already, and I'm just putting in these final highlights, you know, just slight dots, anything that faces up. Again, this is our maximum highlight that we can put in. This is almost like it's pure pigment, pure aluminium pigment. And you can see the edges, I don't paint them too regularly, just dots on the culmination points. And again, I'm treating all these edges, especially those that are facing upwards, with this. Think of it as, you know, the last white highlights that we would put on non-metallic metal. It's really striking how the effect looks. I like it a lot. Yeah, you can focus just on the edges, like I said, or you can create more points of interest. So like back here in that cylindrical object, I'm just painting additional highlights. Then I'm going back to just focusing on edges. And then some in between, you know, dots on surfaces to create additional information and reflection patterns. And just the slightest, you know, dot or line is going to make everything look a lot more interesting, like it is an actual thing that exists. Again, I'm referring to non-metallic metal. On that curved part, the part that curves up is going to be dark, and the flatter part is going to catch a lot more light, so I'm highlighting that one. And like I said, we can create highlight patterns just like we would with non-metallic metal. On any cylindrical object, it would be a straight line running across. Right, and I'm trying to show you how I treat different elements to give you additional ideas. By now you probably got the idea, but I just want to show you different shapes so that you can get ideas of how you would like to treat your Necrons or any other metallic or any other figure that has a lot of metallic parts, obviously. You can take all of this and just apply it to regular metal. Yeah, just pay attention to the interplay of dull pigments or duller parts and how we apply these brighter dots and pixels of white aluminium and how it reflects light and how that interplay makes for interesting results. On the shoulder pads, again, I'm using just dots, and sometimes it's a line, and it's really not a lot of pigment on there, and it also works really well when the pigment dries in a bit, so it's almost like a controlled dry brushing with just a few hairs, just the tip of the brush. You gotta experiment a bit with how the brush leaves pigment, and and which consistencies work better. And I'm putting in a lot more edge highlights, especially on these more striking sculpts like the chest. Edge highlights with white aluminium are going to just dramatically increase the contrast and yeah, the credibility, and just looks so much better. Just all the edges facing up, obviously below the eyes and the back of the nose, anything that will catch a lot of light I'm treating with white aluminium. Edge highlights like these on the shoulder pad again increase our readability, and that's about it. That tells you everything you need to know about how I did these metallics. Again, if you have questions, if something was unclear, put them in the general chat on the Discord. Next up, we're going to see how I changed everything up for the casings. You know, similar techniques, this really old effect of weathered metallics, weathered colored over metallics and so on. So I'll see you in the next video.